During my junior year of college, I was on a bit of a bender. My high school girlfriend finally called it quits for like the third time, and the lure of a one-night stand, caught in the sweaty mist of beer and perfume, was too much for my angry brain to withstand. I was a decent-looking guy back then, built tall and broad with pale eyes that more than one girl compared to Seafoam, not to, brag. I also carried a forlorn look about me that was not entirely calculated, and so it took minimal effort for my reptilian brain to wire the right coordinates towards the triangular patch so coveted by many. In other words, I was a bit of a douchebag. Time blurs the journey from cocky frat boy to settled husband, so I can't really outline all the steps for you. But there was perhaps one night that stood out amongst the others. It was a Friday or maybe a Thursday, I can't recall, but I was attending some smoke-filled stage on a Halloween night. The lights were dimmed, that caked out flesh and smoothed them into really blank faces and bodies. I met a girl, a nice slip of a thing with purple-dyed hair and thick mascara to match. But underneath all the clownery, I could see that she was beautiful, and that intrigued me. Sometimes you get hot, sometimes you get cute or fine, but rarely do you get beautiful. At the end of the night, being the gentleman that I am, I ended it, and I generously agreed to walk back to her home with her. That was odd, I remember, that she lived with her parents, who happened to be near campus, but no matter. Arm in arm, we swayed through the peaking lights. Her one arm settled lightly on mine. Bethany, she had whispered in my ear, and my swoony brain tried to keep the name mid-air. At some point, we directed ourselves and conveniently were placed right outside my single. I glanced over at Bethany and realized with some annoyance that she was in no state for shenanigans. No, though her eyes were bright with drink and adrenaline, her head was drooping down. Fine, be it as it may, I was a bit of a douchebag, but I was really not going to partake with somebody who didn't want to partake with me. I tried to get her to tell me where she lived, but she was starting to doze, and so we found ourselves in my bedroom at 2 a.m. Good intentions, I swear. The buzz was wearing off, and I was settling onto a futon while the girl was safely on the box spring twin. That's right, I'm a pretty classy guy. I had dozed off for perhaps maybe a minute when I jolted awake. I glanced up to see Bethany sitting upright, combing her hair back with her fingers and muttering something to herself. I jumped up and sat on the bed, still safely away while taking a temperature of the mood. Hey, are you okay? Can't sleep, she said, which seemed incongruent with the state of her 5 minutes ago. Can you stay up with me? She ended up asking. There was something in her voice, timid like a child knocking on her parents' door, which indicated the night would not take me the way I was hoping. Fair enough. I had snipped the cord of hope well before we even set foot in my apartment, so this wasn't really that big of a deal. But what was this now? About staying up with her? What do you want to do? I asked. Her silence was prolonged and awkward. Through the dim light, I could see her features delicate with her hair hanging down her face. Beautiful, remember? But also young and scared, and she reminded me a bit of my sister. There was a game we used to play called the 100 Lights, and perhaps inspired by this, I offered this option. We could tell each other ghost stories. Bethany glanced at me and said, "What do you mean?" I shrugged, a bit embarrassed already. Just something my sister and I used to do when we were kids. We called it 100 Stories, based on an old story. You were supposed to light 100 candles and take turns telling stories. After each story, you extinguished a candle, so that by the end, you were in pitch darkness. And then a real ghost was supposed to come. My paramour, not-to-be, glanced around. Well, where would we get 100 candles? I laughed. Well, obviously we didn't light any candles, but we improvised. We could start with the bathroom light, for example, and then the desk lamp, and then the overhead light, and so on. Kind of a fun way to end the night, no? And in the spirit of Halloween. Okay, but on one condition, she said, and then looked away. You have to draw the curtains tight. It was a bit odd, but it made sense, I suppose. I flicked on all the lights in the bedroom and drew the curtains tight over the window, guaranteeing pitch blackness when it was all done. As I jolted the curtain shut, I glanced at the two lampposts shining dimly in the misty night air. Below, shadows flickered, and I shivered thinking about what might be out there. Somewhat invigorated by this game, I launched into the first story, a classic about a boy who finds a tail and then learns of a creature that it belonged to. After finishing it, I stood up and flicked off the light to the living room outside. The room was still bright, and Bethany, who was looking as sober as ever, smiled at me. Her story was refreshingly creepy, about a demonic cat that slowly killed off family members one by one. I couldn't even recall hearing it before. Upon finishing, she stopped and walked over to the desk lamp, shutting it off. As I walked by, I caught a whiff of her perfume, and I marveled at how the theme of the night shifted so much. Now it's my turn. A story about vampires in a small town. I kind of cheated, as this one was based off my favorite stories by one of my favorite authors. Then Bethany went on and told a weird story about a ghost that swallowed people's souls and then turned them into lunatics. The details of this story escape me, but I remember it was more weird than scary. I finished my next story, and as I was just about to turn off the last light which hung over the bedroom, that's when Bethany pointed to the DVD player still glimmering its time in the dimming room. "That first," she said. Somewhat annoyed about being told about my own game, I complied. Bethany launched into yet another story about a giant who rose from the earth and killed a small boy. Much detail went into the vivid descriptions of rending flesh and splattered guts. And if it were bright enough, she would have seen my mouth open. "Okay." I started when she finished. I moved towards the final light, and her head shook again with a sudden blur. She pointed to the cell phone. Oh, the blinking light, she wanted it off. A sense of dread crept down my spine, but I shook it off. Wasn't this just some random girl at a party I picked up? We were playing some weird children's game, true, but I came up with it, not her. Somewhat impressed by her dedication, I switched off my cell phone. My turn. I told a quick, almost banal story about nothing much at all, really just to get it over with. Then, as almost an act of defiance, she mixed with humor. I went to the kitchen and unplugged the fridge. There, I thought with satisfaction. Two can play at that game. There was just one light left, and it was Bethany's turn. The overhead light in the bedroom cast a faint glow over her features. In a low monotone, she launched into it. Once there was a young girl who was never allowed to leave her home. Her parents were very strict and enforced a curfew every night. Thinking that her parents were really just old-fashioned, which may have stemmed from her older brother's untimely suicide years ago, this girl began to rebel in high school. She would stay out longer and longer and test her parents' limits, finally electing to spend one night locked in her science lab at school. When she woke up the next day, she opened the door to her father waiting for her. To her surprise and somewhat horror, he had tears in her eyes. "Dad, what is it?" the girl asked. "Honey, it's time you knew," the father explained to the daughter, that the reason they never really let her spend the night away from home was because of what happened to the girl while she slept. You see, there was a curse on this girl's family, passed from generation to generation. The women in the family, when they fell asleep, they changed. "Changed?" the girl asked her father. "What do you mean, changed?" We never really know what it is like to sleep, do we? Even in the presence of others, when we sleep, we are unaware of ourselves. Maybe we all briefly change. Matter changing into something else. How do we know? We are asleep. But, the father continued, some of us change for longer than that. We change into things. Things that beget unspeakable horrors. The girl laughed. "Are you implying that when I fall asleep, I turn into some kind of monster like Medusa?" "I only wish," her father said. "We know what Medusa looks like. This is something more, something that has no words." And for a second, he began to weep loudly. After hearing this, she of course began to experiment. She set up a video camera at night, but every night, like clockwork, she would turn off the camera right before she fell asleep. She never really remembered doing this, mind you. And she just watched herself the next day get up and move over and hit the off button. It was as if whatever lived in her head had a desire to survive, and so it ensured it would never be caught. It was then that the girl began to believe her father. One night before bed, she knocked on his door. As she walked in, like a light bulb, she realized that her parents might sleep separately for reasons other than what she assumed. "Dad, have you ever seen Mom change?" Her father looked at her with wide eyes. "No," he whispered, "but your brother did." The girl never again stayed away from her parents' home. She always ensured that she was in bed like clockwork at a reasonable hour, away from the eyes of others, and so we are all safe. As the story ended, Bethany looked at me. Wordlessly, she got up and flicked off the last light switch. The room plummeted into deep darkness. "Nice story," I wanted to say, but I found myself unable to speak. Bethany was silent, and I heard her yawn and lie down. Within a minute, I heard the rhythmic breathing of her slumber. I sat immobile in the dark. Somehow the darkness seemed to deepen around the direction of my bed. I heard muffled breathing that grew deeper and coarser, and I felt something stir where Bethany was lying. It rustled and moved slowly in my direction. I wanted to move and I wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. The rustling grew louder and I felt the sheets of the bed slide off. And then just as abruptly, the rustling slowed and stopped. The coarse breathing also abruptly ended and there was dead silence. My hand then twitched towards the light switch, but I otherwise sat still. It would be hours until morning.